Good evening. Ask any youngster, or any adult for that matter, when did Africans first come to America? And the answer will be in 1619 as indentured servants. Well, that answer is no longer valid, according to Dr. Ivan van Sertima, author of They Came Before Columbus. Dr. van Sertima, an anthropologist and historian, is a graduate of London University and Rutgers Graduate School of Anthropology. He is also a literary critic and has been honored by the Nobel Committee of the Swedish Academy by being asked to nominate candidates for the Nobel Prize in Literature for the past 5 years. Currently, he is Professor of African Studies at Rutgers University. Dr. van Sertima, up until relatively recently, what had scholars been saying about Africans in the pre-Columbus period in the Americas?
Well, there is a very profound distortion of African history. Almost all of the books that have been written on Africa have been studies of primitives, of people in small communities just barely scratching the soil, people in jungles, etc. There is no appreciation of the fact that after the conquest, or just around the time of the conquest and after, you have a tremendous breaking up of African societies. It's not just a question of tearing these people out of their country, throwing them across the Atlantic as slaves, but the smashing of many things. It's as if you had dropped several hydrogen bombs on Africa. So that what you see afterwards is just the remnants, the ruins of the worst in Africa. The African, therefore, the image of the African ancestor has been built up upon the lowest common denominator. When we go back to European history, European heritage, we always go back to its great heroes, its magnificent achievements. But when we go back into Africa, historians and anthropologists have always looked for the worst. When in fact you begin to study African history seriously, and recent archaeological discoveries have now throwing up remarkable things. They have found within recent years, for example, that the Africans were producing steel in Tanzania, East Africa, 1,500 years before the Europeans. That they had not only entered the age of iron before Europe, but they had jumped into the age of steel. Now what has happened to this? If you go back into Tanzania today, you cannot find this. You cannot find that kind of development. Therefore, you begin to be aware that colonization, the conquest of Europe, didn't drag people up. It actually smashed things that were happening there. Now these things are coming out of the earth because archaeology is beginning to recover these things. African history cannot be recovered, and even American history, early history, cannot be recovered like European history, because Europe has had the advantage after the conquest of having about 5 centuries of fairly settled history. They can go to their libraries, etc., in spite of the wars. But in Africa, the library is in the ground. The record of what has happened, the broken record, lies there. Now they're finding astronomical observatories. 2 years ago, they found that the Africans were involved in the most complex astronomy, that they had plotted a whole star system. This is in Kenya, at Namorotunga. They found among the Dogon in West Africa that Africans had plotted an invisible star 700 years before it was discovered by European astronomers in the 20th century, and that the plotting of the orbit and trajectory of this star, which is a white dwarf, an invisible star, Sirius B, the trajectory and plotting, the plotting of the orbits and trajectories are as accurate as that done by satellites in the 20th century. Recently, yesterday in fact, just before I came here, the New York Times brought out a startling article showing that the Africans had entered the domestication of cattle in East Africa 7,000 years before it occurred anywhere else in the world. And this is one of the bases. This is one of the bases of civilization. So that you have to look again at the African. It is because the capacity of the African, the potential of the African, has been reduced in our imagination and our consciousness by these studies of primitives, that we do not realize that the African was involved in things that are just as important, just as significant, and in some areas even more significant than what was happening in Europe before the Industrial Revolution.
What is the main idea in your book, They Came Before Columbus?
The main idea in my book is to show that early America, America before the coming of Columbus, was a far more complex society than people imagined, and that it involved Africans. Africans came in here. They came in on several occasions. Sometimes these were accidents, sometimes they were on purpose, and that they had an influence, an actual impact and influence upon the formation of certain American civilizations.
When we say pre-Columbus period, what are we talking about?
We're talking about long before 1492. It is absurd, and only fools can still believe that Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492. In fact, Columbus never even came to this continent. Columbus wandered about in the Caribbean islands just on the very edge of the great civilizations. Cortez came here in 1519, and he entered Mexico. And Mexico, when I speak of Mexico in this program, do not confuse it simply with the Mexico we know today. That was a center of a civilization that spread over a great part of this continent. That, when Cortez entered, he had come out of the heart of Europe, and he said when he entered Native America, when he entered Mexico, and he saw the pyramids and the palaces and the floating gardens and the zoos and the aqueducts and the running baths, he says, I have not seen its like in Europe.
So the main idea in your book, you were dealing with that initially.
The main idea in my book is that there were visits to this continent from the old world, that there were visits to the Native Americans in this continent, and those visits included Africans. And two of the visits of Africans were major and significant, and they affected American civilization. And American civilization was far more complex, far more advanced than was formerly believed. Earth satellites a few months ago revealed that the Native Americans, long before the coming of Europeans, had the most intricate network of irrigation canals ever discovered in agriculture.
Okay, let us clear up one thing before we go any further. In the book that came before Columbus, you used the terms Negro Nubian, Negro Egyptian. Why?
Well, that in some ways is unfortunate. I found it necessary to use the word Negro. I no longer use it. I'm now the editor of the Journal of African Civilizations, and I use the word Africoid for African types, skulls, etc. The reason why I was forced to use the word I had been trained in European anthropology and archaeology. All the books I had read used this term, not necessarily with the social implications which it has here. They use this term to separate Africoid types of people from Caucasoids or Mongoloid types, Asiatic and European types. Also, it is a word that has entered neutrally, without any social significance, in the languages of many people who do not have the same kind of prejudices as people in the Anglo-American and some of the Western nations who became colonial powers. Like in some languages in Europe, they use the term Niger, simply meaning black, without any of those connotations. Furthermore, the problem lay in that the word black could not always be used, because if you spoke of a black god, it may not be an African. You can have a black god who is not an African. Tezcatlipoca, for example, is a Native American god who is black, but he's not African. But there is a god, Nawalpili, who is both black and African. He's not only black in a ritual or symbolic sense, but he has Africoid features. So that was the problem I faced, and I had to make those connections, because when people talked of Nubians, they didn't often realize they were talking about black people.
In the first few pages of They Came Before Columbus, you write about when Columbus himself heard about about Africans, the possibility of Africans having been here years before. What about that?
Yes, so Columbus is the first man to give historical witness and evidence of Africans in America before him. In his journals, in his letters, you have evidence of this. He mentions that when he came back from his first voyage, he went to see the Portuguese. He didn't actually go there on purpose. A storm drew him into Lisbon, Portugal. He'd been sent out by the Spanish. The Portuguese invited him to the court, and there he learnt from the Portuguese, who were moving across Africa, who had set up the first fort among Europeans in Africa, that African sailors had actually crossed over the Western Ocean and had found a land mass in the south. This was not what Columbus had found. Columbus found islands, which are now known as the Caribbean islands, but he had not gone on to a continental mass. The Africans had found the actual continental mass. And the Portuguese insisted that this continental mass in the south was 370 leagues, which is about 15 to 1600 miles away, according to whether you count a league as 4 or 4.5. There were differences in counting of a league, but it was about 1500 to 1600 miles away from Africa. And they pointed this out. And Columbus went back to Spain and he insisted, because the Portuguese promised to help him, he insisted that they should draw a line across the world and that this line should be drawn 370 leagues away from the Cape Verde Islands across Africa, and that Spain would claim lands he had found on the other side, and if Portuguese found land within that line on the other side, they could claim it. And Brazil, which was visited by the Africans, was on the other side of the line. And this line was drawn in 1494. It was drawn up in June 1494, before any Europeans had come to South America, on the basis of African knowledge.
Okay, let's get down to the crux of the matter. How did these Africans come to the New World?
Okay, now one of the things, as I have pointed out, in the metallurgy, like the steel, etc., in astronomy, etc., there is a profound misunderstanding of African capacity. The Africans had ships. This is one of them. This is in East Africa. This ship, this is just a model which I found in Fort Mombasa in Kenya. This ship is a 70-tonner. Ships like these in the 13th century before Columbus took elephants to China, right across the Indian Ocean. But this is just, they had ships like this in East Africa before Christ, but there were ships in North Africa along the Mediterranean that were far more sophisticated than any ships the Europeans had. European shipping is not even European. The sail Columbus used comes out of the Arab-African world. The astrolabe comes out of the Arab-African world. They found in the desert before Columbus, in the period before Columbus, the Africans were using compasses and nautical instruments to navigate the desert. They had these instruments which were used to navigate the sea. They've done studies recently of navigation in West Africa showing the Africans did have boats along the Niger. The African had boats that could take 3 camels aboard ship. They had cabins, all of these along the Niger, which opens, if you go down the Senegambia at a certain point, it opens out into the Atlantic. And the Africans did have empires with an Atlantic border.
This is a simple question. It's going to sound simple, but you're talking about black people.
Yes.
Okay.
And on several occasions, Africans were able to make that journey. If you look at a map of currents, and we will look more closely at this later on in the program, you will see there are 3 currents that take you from Africa to America. Africa is half the distance from America as is Europe. Not only is it half the distance, it is far easier to get from Africa to America because the currents take you automatically. In other words, you don't have to know of the existence of America. Even Columbus was not aware of the existence of America. He came off the North Atlantic. Columbus thought he was going to India, and he struck out for the latitude of Japan, hoping to land in India, and he swore he was in India. That is why people like myself are called West Indians. I'm the Indian he found in the West. And Americans are called American Indians because he thought they were in India. So that you have these currents which take you automatically. European ships did not use these currents until the second voyage, when Columbus used that knowledge which he got from the Portuguese about Africans. On the third voyage, on the second voyage, Columbus heard from the American natives in Hispaniola, which is now known as Haiti and San Domingo, that Africans had come to the Native Americans. The Americans told Columbus that. He recorded it in his journals, that Africans had come to them trading in gold-tipped spears. Columbus sent samples of those spears. They were studied, they were surveyed in Spain, and they were found to contain the same ratio of gold, silver, and copper alloys as those found in West African Guinea.
So were these Africans swept along this current,
Yes.
or did they come purposely?
Initially, it was an accident. Just like initially Columbus's so-called discovery, rather his coming here in a late period, was an accident.
What's the name of this current?
There are several of them.
Okay.
There's the South Equatorial Current, there's the North Equatorial Current. These currents come, there's a current coming off the Senegambia coast, there's a current coming off the Cape Verde Islands, there's a current coming up from the southern part of Africa. These currents all move towards South America, into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico. And there's a return current. And we have evidence that Africans not only went, but in a late pre-Columbian period, they also returned, because we found American things which Africans brought back. Just as we have found African things in America, they found American things which Africans brought back with them, such as the cotton in the Cape Verde Islands.
Are these currents still
Oh yes,
still in
oh yes,
existence?
for thousands of years, these currents have been in existence. This has been tested. 200 small boats, some of them smaller than the major African boats, have crossed the Atlantic. They have been tested. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer, got Africans to build a ship used long before the birth of Christ, used in Egypt and Ethiopia. And this ship was made of papyrus reed, and the scientists said it couldn't float. And Heyerdahl insisted, and the Africans under Abdullah de Jibrin built the ship, and it crossed the Atlantic successfully to America.
From what part of Africa did these Africans come?
The Africans came at various times from different areas. The one that I want to deal with, because most of the evidence exists for this, is Africans who came out of the Egyptian Nubian world. I'll call it the Egypto-Nubian world, around 800 years before Christ. I'll explain to you how I arrive at that date, how they arrived at that date, and I'll show you the types of evidence. Now, I want you first to look at this head, this stone head.
Okay.
Now, this head, they found a dozen of these heads. They found them in a very specific area. Before we go to the area, look at the head carefully. The lips, the very generous type of lips that you find in the tropical areas, the Africoid type. The broad nose with the very broad, flared type of nostril and the kind of flattened base. The brow ridge. And look at the helmet. That's a very peculiar type of helmet. It does not occur anywhere else in America. It has a strap along the face, falling along the ear, and it has a circular ear plug. Those helmets, exact type of helmet, were found in the Egyptian world in this period. What period? The period that has been dated by carbon-14 datings. Now, how do they arrive at that datings? They found these heads, and I want to show you the map now so as to show you precisely where the datings were made by scientists.
Okay.
Now look at that map carefully. That's the Gulf of Mexico. I want to remind the audience, and I want to make it quite clear that when we're talking about Mexico, we're not just simply talking about Mexico today. This is something that happened 3,000 years ago. That's very recent in history. America was peopled 50,000 years ago across the Bering Straits. This is very recent in American history. The United States is only 200 years old, its boundaries. So do not assume for a moment that we're talking about something outside of the United States. That is a center of civilization that occurred around 1,000 years before Christ. In that specific area, and I want to go back to that map, because in that specific area, I'll show you where they found stone heads. Now you see that thing looking like a basin there. That is the center of the first major American civilization. In that center, and specific points marked by diamonds, you may not be able to see the diamond triangles so easily here, but in that specific area, at Tres Zapotes, at San Lorenzo in Veracruz, and at La Venta, they found a dozen African-type stone heads. Vast heads, 6 to 9 feet high, weighing from 10 to 40 tons. The hugest things ever found in American sculpture, built of pure stone. stone which had to be taken from quarries 60 to 80 miles downriver. Suddenly these things begin to appear, and 4 of them appear at a place called Leventa within that basin area. Leventa was the holy capital of the Olmec civilization. And on the platform, the religious platform where those people worshipped, they found a wooden religious platform in which 4 of the heads were embedded. The stone could not be dated, but the wooden platform was inextricably linked up with the stone. The archaeologists took carbon samples, 9 carbon samples, they dated it. It gave a dating 814 plus or minus 134 BC, which means that anything between around 900 and something BC, right down to about 618 BC, you have some strange foreign movement of foreigners into that area. They not only found this type of head, they not only found these type of features, they not only found this type of helmet, but they found terracottas, that is clay portraits of Africans that did not have the helmet, where you could see the texture of hair quite distinct from the Native American head, because the Native American was an Asiatic coming across the Bering Strait, and you have lots of sculptures of that Asiatic figure, and this figure was quite distinct. And they found in the dry areas of the Olmec world skeletons that could be linked with continental African types, Africoid types. Professor Wierzyński, a Polish skull expert, showed that these were African type skeletons.
What purpose did these stone heads serve?
They were religious. They were the sorts of things that you do even today. You make statues to commemorate things. You see a series of those statues there. The one in the middle is not American. The one in the middle is a king, an African king belonging to the same period. He is Taharka, who reigned somewhere around 700 to 654 BC. And before him, there was a whole line of African kings in Egypt, because that is a period from about 1054 BC right down to about 800 BC, you have Africans and Libyans reigning together, having a sort of what is known as the Libyco-Nubian dynasties. And then you have the Nubian dynasties, which run from 800 to 654 BC. So during that whole period, covered by the carbon-14 datings where Olmec culture and civilization appears in America, you have these people appearing in the Egypto-Nubian world. And what is significant is that the same place and the same time these heads and skeletons and clay portraits appear with Africoid type hair and features and helmets, you have things suddenly occurring in the American world that do not occur before. The first pyramid is built in America in that period. It appears on the very same religious platform where the Africoid heads are found. For the first time, the Americans are making these huge statues when before they were making small things largely out of clay. For the first time, they're working in monumental stone. For the first time, the Americans are moving massive blocks of stone from quarries 80 miles away downriver. Nobody, no one in the ancient world mastered the art of transporting vast blocks of stone downriver for sculpture as the Egyptians. The Americans had never done it before, and suddenly they're using a ritual orientation, north-south axis for their pyramids, for their religious platforms. That axis, the north-south axis, is an axis that was used only by the Egyptians at that time. That north-south axis is absolutely important. The Egyptians were so, the African type I'm talking about, because the Africans, they're now establishing, New York Times reported last year on March the 1st, that they found the Egyptian hieroglyphs in Africa before it moves up into Egypt. And Egypt is in Africa, but south of Egypt, that is among the black Africans. They found that the palace symbols, the temples, the religious and political symbols are found in the southern part of Egypt among the Ethiopians before it moves up later into Egypt. The pyramids are built, the most fantastic engineering ever done in the world until our present day, were built by Africans.
Okay, these stone heads, were there any non-African stone heads?
There was one figure that was not as large as these. He was on a slab of stone, and he had a beard, and he had an aquiline nose, and he had a headdress which showed him to be Phoenician. Now the Phoenician figure is very important because both in the Egyptian world at that time, the Nubians, the black Nubians, were protecting the Phoenicians from the Assyrians. The Phoenicians had also moved. Princess Elisar had traveled with 300 Phoenicians down into North Africa, and they began intermarrying among black Africans in North Africa just on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean from about 1000 BC right down until Carthage was built on the basis of that civilization. Recently, studies in Carthage, archaeological studies in Carthage, show that Carthaginian civilization, which included Hannibal and all those fantastic navies, that they were largely African. Now they study the skeletons, they have found it's a largely African civilization. So all of these things were happening around this time. And you get this Carthaginian type figure, this Phoenician type figure whom you find in Carthage at that period, and you find in the Nubian Egyptian world at that period. You see him among these Africoid types. And people, because they're accustomed to the modern world, which is only 500 years old since Columbus, they're accustomed to the black being a slave and thought of as a primitive. When they saw this fair-skinned figure with the aquiline nose beside him, they said he's the master and these are his slaves. If you go to the historical period, you find just the opposite. That Phoenician was a hired navigator because the Phoenicians were involved in the import and export trade of the Egyptians and the Nubians, and they were up and down the Mediterranean. In fact, just a few years after this period, around 600 BC, we have historical records of the Phoenicians circling Africa, going right across the Atlantic and circling Africa.
Okay. Back to this controversy. There is more to this controversy in connection with the stone heads. Can you tell us some more about that? The kettle pots, I think it deals with.
Yes, there are people who claim that those are football helmets or kettle cans, all sorts of things in order to reduce the significance of these figures. But more important is the attempt by traditional Americanists, conservative Americanists, to dismiss this whole thing and said this is a mystery. I was at a conference in Arizona recently, and a Dr. Thompson, who's written a book on the Mayan, he admitted after strong questioning by me that there was every human variety in pre-Columbian America. But he said just a few minutes later, he's absolutely sure the African was not among them. So I said, how could you have every human variety? It doesn't include the African. Isn't the African a human? This is the sort of contradiction in which conservative Americanists are involved.
We'll go along this line, please.
Yes. I was speaking about the type of currents that take Africans into the New World. Now, I lived in South America. I was born in South America on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. And every year, in fact, I realized that when I was a boy of 10, that the many things would come in on the currents along the Atlantic. And some of the things that I found came from Africa. Scientists have found, botanists have found, for example, that the bottle gourd, which is African, can float by itself to America.
Bottle gourd?
The bottle gourd. Yes. It's known in botany as Laginarius caesarea. Now, several things come out of Africa, not just men and ships. So that a man, once you enter that current, once you enter one of those currents, you automatically come to America. In fact, that is the way South America was rediscovered by Europeans. Alvarez Cabral, the Portuguese explorer, was going along Africa. Winds came up and blew his ships to South America. It is so close, really. So that this was a kind of journey that it could have been made thousands of years ago. There is no difficulty about the journey. The reason why people thought it was impossible is because it involved Africans. And since Africans were thought to be the lowest human being, nobody could think they had the capacities or the abilities. That is the reason why I am not only concerned with establishing this kind of contact and this kind of influence on American civilization, but showing what were the true potentials of Africans before the conquest. Now, not only do you have these currents, but you have evidence of boats. You have boats that take you. The Africans had been developing boats in the Niger. They'd been developing boats on the Mediterranean. Now, people have asked, why should they move out of the Mediterranean? But if you study the period in which these heads are found, in which the African presence is found for the first time in America, you will find there was a war on. Asia was moving down. You see this ship, for example, here. This ship was used before Christ.
When was this particular
This was
ship
built in 1969 by Africans who crossed from North Africa at the port of Safi, a North African port, and went right across the Atlantic, moving more than 2,000 miles until they reached the edge of Barbados. Now, this is something that scientists said was impossible. It would get waterlogged, it would sink. And they took the papyrus reed and they put it in a laboratory tank and it sank. And Heyerdahl said, nonsense. The Queen Mary is made of iron, and if I took a piece of the Queen Mary and put it in a laboratory tank, it would also sink.
So this ship is made of what now?
This is made of papyrus reed.
Oh, exactly what
it
is
has
that?
no nails or anything. It's a long sort of fibrous kind of thing.
That comes from what?
It comes from papyrus.
Okay.
That is the thing in itself.
Okay.
It grows like that.
Okay, that's what I'm getting to.
And
okay.
after this, the Egyptians built many marvelous ships. They even affected Phoenician shipping. And the Phoenicians, who I spoke of the last time, many of them became black and mixed with blacks because they moved into the black world. They became friends of the blacks, etc. In fact, a Phoenician king was executed by the Syrians, who were Asiatics, because of his conspiracy with the black kings. Now, bear in mind, these terms are difficult to remember for some people, but it's important to see the picture of the period. That the Assyrians started to move down the Asiatics, who were led by the great power, the Assyrians, not to be confused with the modern Syrians. The Assyrians moved down and started to attack various people. They attacked the Jews. The blacks came and saved the Jews. It's recorded even in the Bible that 700 BC, Taharka, the Ethiopian king, it's mentioned in in a chapter and verse in Kings in the Bible, where the Ethiopian king Taharka came and saved the Jews under Hezekiah when the Assyrian Sennacherib was attacking. And you have the blacks also saving not only the Jews, the blacks protected the Phoenicians, the blacks fought against the Syrians and pushed them and kept them at bay for a long time until eventually the Assyrians invaded Egypt and pushed the blacks back in the south, and there was a north to south movement for quite a while, lots of battles going on. But because of this war, a lot of shipping traffic would push west down the Mediterranean towards the North Atlantic, and because the Phoenicians and blacks had something going called Carthadas, later to be called Carthage, in the North Atlantic, they began moving their ships down, getting metals which were so critical in the war. They were getting these things, copper and to make bronze, copper and tin, and they have evidence of Phoenician ships in the North Atlantic as early as this period. So an accident could have occurred. The ships did not intend to come to America, but they were well equipped to go on other journeys in the North Atlantic. An accident occurred that drove them into mid-Atlantic, and then they moved along those currents into the Gulf of Mexico.
We have a lot of other areas to cover, but what are some of the other evidences of African contact with America that you draw from inferences?
Well, influences, the influence of Africans.
Inferences?
Yes.
Okay.
You have, for example, they have found an American cotton. I don't want to go into the complexities of it, but I have spent a whole chapter on that, where you show that American cotton, which has 26 chromosomes, 13 of the chromosomes are African, showing a marriage occurred between an American wild cotton and an African diploid cotton. Botany. Linguistic. They found many African words in the languages of some of the South American people and some of the Middle American people. Leo Weiner, a Harvard linguist in the 1920s, established that. Metallurgy. They found that they found that Native Americans in parts of the Caribbean were using African spears, metals which were forged by Africans, which were not in the Caribbean, which were never made by Native Americans. This was established by Columbus himself in Spain. The assayers showed that these were African spears. The mixture of alloys were African. In the area of engineering, they found certain, like for example in the Olmec period, they found the ritual orientation of certain buildings and the kind of architecture that was involved and the kind of techniques that were involved were identical. The use of the same heavy transport techniques, the same methods of moving the vast stones, the same method of quarrying, you found evidences like that. And what is most astonishing is that the very place where I'm talking about, where you find these heads and the skeletons and the clay portraits, they found an African script. Now that is the most astonishing thing, because most people do not even know that the Africans have several scripts. They know of the Egyptian, they know of the Meroitic, but they're not aware that Africa actually produced several scripts. The Mande script or Manding script, nothing to do with the later Mandingo, was found at Levanta.
Do you have an example of that here?
I don't have an example of that here, but I want to show you a more recent example, something which I myself found, which was translated by Harvard and by the Libyan Department of Antiquities in North Africa. Now look at this carefully.
Okay.
It's difficult to see the whole of it, but perhaps you can pan across it so that you could see the whole of it. Now this, note that there's an Arabic reading at the bottom. It runs right across a pool. Now you can actually go and see this. You can actually go to United States Virgin Islands, St. John, the Reef Bay Valley, and on a dry day, when the water does not cover it, you can look along the waterline and you will see those markings. Now, since 1888, about 100 years ago, anthropologists and archaeologists have been going to that spot, and they were looking above it at various markings which they could not understand. But when I got there, I noticed there were dots and crescents. You see those things at the edges? Right. Away from the sort of spiral figures on the head and so on. The little dots and crescents.
Right.
Now there are peculiar formations that are extremely regular. And I was given permission by the Virgin Islands government to, I put my finger in there for 2 days, got the exact sort of depressions, took away the incrustations in the moss, put chalk in them, and they were photographed. And then they were taken to Barry Fell at Harvard, and the Libyan Department of Antiquities established that this is the Tifinagh branch of a Libyan script, and that this was used before Columbus. Some of it was even used before Islam. It was used before Columbus, and it has been given a translation. It's right above a pool, and it has a specific translation which was given. It is plunging to cleanse and dissolve away impurity. This is water for ritual ablution before devotion.
You're saying that that's what that says?
That is what that says. And they have shown this script. It's not something you can deny. It's not something that you can confute, because they have shown the markings, these dot and crescent formations. They have established it to be a script in North Africa. It was used before Columbus. It was used by people in southern Libya. It was used by blacks in the Sudan. It was used by the Tamahak Berbers in Mali. It was used by a 13th century cliff-dwelling people in Mali. All of these various black and mixed peoples made use of that script. Okay. And so you have evidences like these.
What about mummification?
Well, mummification was found in South America. Now, that map which we showed you at the beginning, that map which has a sort of basin that leads down into South America, that shows you that in America, and we are very confused about the word America, because when we think of America, we think of a very little place, the United States. That's only about a quarter of the American continent. America is one continent. It's only at the beginning of the 19th century that they cut a little canal between the two Americas. You have connections between those two continents. They've found, for example, the Olmec culture I talk about links up with Chavin culture in South America. In South America, they have found Egyptian influences.
Where would the Olmec culture be today, the Olmec area?
That is the Gulf of Mexico. You can go to Levanta. All you will see there now is the pyramid. You'll see almost nothing else. All these heads have been carted away. They're in museums, Museum of Anthropology in Mexico. One of them is in Washington. They're all over the place. to come back to mummification,
right,
because one is so overwhelmed by the facts that one has gathered about this over the years. But mummification, they found very clear evidence of this in South America. The exact formula, which nobody else in the world knew or could repeat. The exact Egyptian formula. Professor Rueta found that the same substances in the same combination, the same formula was being used in South America to mummify some of their things. Now, this was not found so easily in Olmec, Mexico, because the area at La Venta is so swampy that the humidity is so corrosive that these things did not survive. But they found it in the sculptures. They found Egyptian-type sculptures with the shroud, with the type of headdress, with the arms crossing like this with the fingers open. They opened the fingers so that the dead could not grab onto their souls. This was a sort of myth or ritual, and you find this repeated in the Olmec world. Quite a number of rituals, in fact, that were Egyptian you find in the Olmec world. The double crown, rituals of the kings, the use of purple as an index of royalty.
In the book you talk about a finding by the University of Oklahoma, I think it is. What about that?
Yes, in 1963, the University of Oklahoma discovered that one of the Egyptian mummies, Princess Mini, was so well preserved that you could take some of the cells, thousands of years after, you could take some of the cells and transplant it in a body, and it would still be able to be operative. That is, it is almost as if you had, like in the sorts of things they do today where they take out kidneys, etc. Some of the cells were so well preserved, it's almost as if they had lived in a block of ice, as it were, that they could be transplanted into a body.
What about the influence of the African calendar on the New World calendar?
Well, that is very complex, because the New World had several calendars, and the Egyptians had several calendars, but one of them contained identical symbols and also a body of things that indicated that it was Egyptian. I don't remember the details because it's some years since I wrote the book, but the calendars are complex because you have so many types of calendars, but one of them, as Abbé Hervas has established, one of them was identical with the Egyptian and indicated an influence.
You talked earlier about Egypt and Nubia. What was the relationship between Egypt and Nubia?
Well, the thing that you have to understand about that, you have to understand the early beginnings of Egypt. It has now been established that Egypt, in its first 1,000 years at least, was almost completely and totally black African. Those were the critical years. Those are the years in which the pyramids were built. Those are the years of high science in Egypt. Those were the years in which the political, the administrative, the scientific structures were laid down. Now, in later periods, because Egypt had 3,000 years of history, no people have ever had such a long history. All civilizations come to an end. And in a later period, when you have invasions and you have other peoples coming in, the whole thing becomes mixed up. And you have to study the periods closely to know which is the African element and which is not. But in the critical years of the civilization, the African influence is dominant and overwhelming.
Okay. You have an example here, I think, of mathematics developed by Africans, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
I think I think we're getting a shot of it. Okay.
Now that, if you could lift it slightly to go along the sort of bone, that's a bone that was found in the Congo. It's known as the Ishango bone. And if you go further across, you will see it in a diagram indicating the first use of numbers in the world. That is 8,000 years old. That is the beginning of mathematics in Africa and the beginning of mathematics in the world. You see later in Egypt other developments during the African-dominated period. Now you see, it is this, and I must stress this again and again, we have a very, very poor idea of the African, both blacks and whites, because blacks are just as influenced by the propaganda of history as any other people. We have such a poor impression of the African because all of the studies of Africa have focused upon little people, people scratching the soil, people being worried by plague and disease and starvation, that we think that that is the African. That's a small part of the African. Even in roots, the same sort of myth emerges. You see this little Kunta Kinte coming out of some idyllic little village on the Gambia. That's just a small part of the African. There are other rooms to the African. The African embraced other civilizations. Now they're discovering a whole range of complexity in the African.
Well, let me ask you this. Why is this information just coming out, or is it just coming out?
It is only just coming out for two reasons. The one reason that that shouldn't arouse much passion is the fact that the archaeologists are only now catching up. You see, archaeology is fairly new. Serious archaeology is fairly new. Carbon-14 was not used until 1946. And Africa has been such a fragmented and shattered continent through the invasions and the disruption and the conquest that you can't go and pick up books from libraries and say, well, this is African history. So most people who go out to Africa, they search for the simplest and easiest thing to study. They find a tribe with 25 people or 100 people. It's very easy. It's not a complex society. So you get the impression that that's what Africa is about, simple people. And then they split up Africa, and then eventually there are wars among people who shouldn't be in a certain kind of structure that they have made for them. And they said, you see, the African is chaotic. He's never accustomed to great government. So one reason is archaeology. The other reason, obviously, is cultural racism. That you have to understand that after the African was turned into slave, it was absolutely important to make one's conscience, the conscience of the European, had to be assuaged. They had to say to themselves, well, look, I have a right to make this man to a slave because he is primitive. He's not as good as I am. I have to look after him, poor fellow. He's just a child in the world. As Albert Schweitzer said, the African is my brother, but he's my younger brother by several centuries. That sort of insult was thrown at the African people, and people had to believe that their books told them it was true. They didn't see the steel, they didn't see the astronomy, they didn't see the mathematics, they didn't see the engineering, they didn't see any of these things.
You mentioned astronomy just then. The last piece of illustration we want to deal with, I think, the star system.
Now look
or
at
something.
this.
Okay.
And it's a pity that we can't get a whole picture, but this is the Dogon, a West African people, giving you a map, a chart of the orbit and trajectories of an invisible star. The Russians have recently discovered, they're extremely secretive. They have written me after I wrote, they came before Columbus. The New York Times made a big fuss about it. Russians wrote me from their academy asking me for some information. But when I wrote them back and asked them for other information, they wouldn't give it to me. But this, the Russians discovered recently that the Africans had telescopes in ancient times. Now that first one is, the one on the left is African. The one on the right is what our Earth satellites produce in the 20th century. They are identical. Now that's a white dwarf. It's invisible. Only with very skillful astronomy, complex astronomy, and the Africans did that 700 years ago, that you could work out this kind of thing. Do you know how they've tried to explain that? They've written, Kenneth Brecher at Massachusetts Institute of Technology said the Africans have no business knowing any of this. And in England, Robert Temple's Royal Astronomical Observatory wrote a whole book, The Sirius Mystery, because this is Sirius B, the invisible star, the companion of Sirius A, stating that space people came down and gave the Africans that knowledge. So that is the way these things are being explained because of the profound contempt for the African ancestor.
Well, let me just ask you this: what is it about the mind, the psyche of some white scholars that compels them to deny contributions?
Part of it is habit. Part of it is habit. I have found to my astonishment that even black scholars behave like that. I was astonished, for example, after I pointed out, and I'm not going to call his name because I don't want to embarrass him, I pointed out to a famous African historian that he was wrong about Hannibal. that there were recent archaeological discoveries that he doesn't know about, showing that the Carthaginian civilization was largely African, even the aristocracy was largely African, that they have found that the so-called Punic figure or Phoenician figure, which was supposed to be dominant, there are very few elements of that, and they've checked it with skulls and skeletons in the Phoenician capitals, Tyre and Sidon, and they haven't found that type in Carthage easily. They found the Africoid type. And I said, look at this coin. It has Hannibal on one side and it has the elephant on the other, and it's a Negroid figure. Africoid, sorry. He says, well, you can't tell, it may be an elephant rider. It doesn't have to be Hannibal. But I said, look, these people never made coins of anyone but kings or people in great authority. They never made coins out of little people. How suddenly they're starting to make coins out of elephant riders when that is Hannibal's victory with the elephants? So both the archaeological evidence points to it, as well as the coin with Africoid types, and there's several coins with the Africoid types, not the Punic type, not the Phoenician type, and on the other side is the elephant struck in Carthage. And yet he would deny this. It's a habit of mine. It's an assumption built upon years of a certain historical propaganda that this man is really a man, a half-naked savage with bows and arrows going in the jungle. Africa has less jungle than any other continent comparable with its land space. There is almost no African kingdom or empire that was in the jungle. The Mali Empire had no jungle. The Egyptian empires, all of these things are not jungle empires. Even most of these great West African, the Ghana, Songhai, etc., very little of that was jungle.
So if we can summarize, if it is possible to summarize,
yes.
What do we know, what can we say briefly about Africans in early America?
What we could say is that there is evidence in many fields: botany, epigraphy, which is scripts, sculpture, linguistics, metallurgy. In many fields there is evidence of an African presence in various historical periods. Some that came by accident, some came on purpose, as in the Mandingo journeys in the 14th century. We can show that in the very earliest period that Africans not only came, because that is not important, because other people came here as well. They not only came, but they left a mark, an influence upon a significant and advanced civilization. And the other point I want to make, and I want to close on this, is that it is only because we have thought of the African as a primitive, and there are African primitives, there are European primitives. I've lived among European primitives. I've lived all over the world except Asia. And I've lived in villages in Europe which today are more primitive than some villages in Africa still.
Why don't you hear about those?
Yeah, because people don't write, anthropologists don't go into European villages to write about European villages. Anthropologists like to go among so-called exotic peoples to study little tribal dances and little gestures and kinship systems. So to give the impression this is what the world was like at one stage among us. So if you want to know your beginnings, you have to go back to these simple peoples. We are the complex peoples and these are the simple peoples. The people without technology, well, that is the greatest fiction, that the Africans lack technology.
Our time is running out. You have undertaken a great task. What is the point of it all?
The point of it all is to transform the black psyche. We have got to stop thinking of ourselves simply in terms of primitives and slaves. We have got to walk out of this small room of history, this small room in consciousness, into the larger house of man. That is the purpose.
Okay. Our time is real short now. What made you write this book?
Well, that would take me a long time to answer, but I could sum it up by saying that I've always been haunted.
I mean, when did you decide that you were going to write this book?
I decided to write that in 1971. I began by writing against the thesis because I didn't believe in it. And when I finished writing against it, I discovered evidence that it was indeed a fact.
What kinds of obstacles have you run into in the process of writing They Came Before Columbus?
Well, there are certain discoveries that I came upon which I found great difficulty in pursuing, like the Smithsonian Institution, for example, who blocked the work I was doing in the Virgin Islands, where they found 2 African pre-Columbian skeletons.
Why do they block it?
They blocked it for reasons of their own. I was to discover later what those reasons are, but I'm not at liberty to talk about that.
Do you think that racism would be as rampant today if the world knew the true black man and black woman?
I think that one needs more than that. I think that peoples as a whole have to realize that no great civilizations came through any pure race, that people contributed to each other, that people owe a debt to each other. And that is the most important thing.
And we owe a heavy debt to you. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, author of They Came Before Columbus. The book is called They Came Before Columbus.
Dr. Ivan Van Sertima was a renowned scholar and an influential figure in the field of Afrocentric studies. His life's work was rooted in the firm belief that history is often told from a singular perspective, one that marginalizes or omits the contributions and experiences of people of African descent. He dedicated himself to unraveling narratives that displayed the richness of African civilizations and their contributions to the world. Born in Guyana in 1935, Van Sertima's early life was shaped by an awareness of colonialism and its effects on Black identity. He would eventually move to the United States, where he pursued higher education, earning degrees in anthropology and linguistics. It was there that the seeds of his revolutionary ideas began to grow. Van Sertima's academic journey was not just about personal achievements. It was about challenging the existing paradigms that often ignored or diminished the role of African people in the broader tapestry of history. One of his most significant contributions is the book They Came Before Columbus, published in 1976. In this work, Van Sertima presents a compelling argument that African people had traveled to the Americas long before Christopher Columbus's infamous voyage in 1492. Using a combination of historical, archaeological, and linguistic evidence, he challenged the dominant narrative that often placed European explorers at the center of the story of the New World. This thesis was not merely an academic exercise for Van Sertima. It was a means of reclaiming African agency in historical discourse. In his research, Van Sertima highlighted the voyages of the Mandingo and other West African peoples who, he argued, navigated the oceans long before European explorers. He examined ancient maps and records, analyzed terms from African languages, and drew upon oral histories that had been passed down for generations. His work suggested that the encounter between Africa and the Americas was not a one-sided affair, but rather a complex interplay of cultures that had been interconnected for centuries. For many, this was eye-opening, as it provided an alternative narrative that recognized the intellect and capabilities of African civilizations. Van Sertima was unyielding in his quest for truth within the framework of the academic establishment, which was often resistant to his ideas. He faced criticism, but he continued to advocate for the acknowledgement of African contributions to global history. His resilience in the face of opposition resonated with many who felt similarly marginalized by historical narratives that painted Africa as a continent without a rich heritage. He was also a consummate educator, recognized for his ability to engage audiences from various backgrounds. As a professor at Rutgers University, he nurtured a generation of scholars who would go on to explore and expand upon his ideas. His compelling way of conveying complex concepts made history accessible, and he encouraged students to question and think critically about the information presented to them. He opened the door for discussions about identity, heritage, and the implications of historical erasure, empowering many to embrace their roots and challenge oppressive narratives. Van Sertima's work transcended academia. It became part of a larger movement that sought to uplift Black voices and celebrate African heritage. His ideas were a call to action, urging individuals to seek knowledge about their history and to recognize the vast contributions of African cultures to world civilization. The impact of his scholarship has been felt far beyond the university walls. influencing writers, artists, and activists dedicated to the fight against systemic oppression and historical amnesia. In addition to They Came Before Columbus, Van Sertima wrote numerous other works that explored various aspects of African history and culture. His commitment to uncovering and disseminating knowledge remained unwavering until the end of his life. He edited the Journal of African Civilizations, which became a platform for scholars to share research that celebrated African history and challenged prevailing misconceptions. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima was more than just a scholar. He was a beacon of knowledge for those hungry for truth. His unwavering dedication to unveiling the complexities of African history empowered many to adopt a more nuanced understanding of the world. He stood as a testament to the importance of representation in history, reminding us that everyone's story is essential, and the erasure of any group's contributions is an injustice that must be rectified. His legacy continues to inspire generations to honor and acknowledge the past, while fervently advocating for a more inclusive narrative that truly reflects the diversity of human experience. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please like, share, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. And be sure to tell a friend to tell a friend, sending love to each one of you. Feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts